Fellow Falcoholics, what is up? Welcome to another episode of the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. I'm your host, Kevin. I'm Falcoholic Kevin, and the 2025 schedule for the Atlanta Falcons has finally released. We know the weeks, we know the bye. It's in week 5. That's unfortunate. But now we can actually dig in a little bit more to what the schedule means. If you missed Wednesday's live show with Joe Patrick, we kind of broke down our initial thoughts on the schedule, the reveal itself, sort of our takeaways on the first 6 weeks, which will be quite difficult. It will certainly be an opportunity for Atlanta as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. But this is just going to be kind of a quick show talking about more of the analysis of the schedule. So I know our very own Adnan Ikic wrote up the rest advantage side of things, which looks at basically how many games you have an advantage in rest days versus your opponent. And obviously Sharp Football has done something similar, and then we have kind of the overall strength of schedule that we can look at as well to kind of get an idea of just how intense this schedule is beyond the opponents and the sort of arrangement of the weeks. So that's going to be today's topic. We're going to get into this schedule a little bit, more of the analytical side of things. And hat tip, of course, to Adnan for his work on the rest advantage. Just sort of give my thoughts on the construction of the schedule and where I think the Falcons have some opportunities and where I think they're going to have some difficulties, and a schedule that is, in reality, pretty tough. Pretty tough in certain spots. Now, overall, maybe less so, but that's part of what we're going to get into today. So before I forget, let me bring you guys a word from our sponsor, BetOnline. Folks, BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for all your sports betting action this season. Baseball's in full swing, and we're into the NBA and NHL playoffs coming down the home stretch in those sports, and BetOnline's got more ways than ever to stay in on the action with the latest odds, news, and scores, even live in-game betting options while the games are being played. BetOnline's got the largest selection of odds on everything. We mentioned the MLB, the NBA, and NHL playoffs, but also UFC, esports, all that stuff. They've got it there. BetOnline remains the best online source for your sports wagering information in between games. Also, you can head on over to BetOnline's online casino where they've got all the top Vegas-style games, including live poker and live slots. So what are you waiting for, folks? Go ahead and sign up over there on betonline.ag and use our promo code BELIEVE. That's BLEAV to get access to the latest promotions. BetOnline, the game starts here. All right. So we're going to start real quick. I'll run down the schedule for you guys. It's also on thefalcoholic.com, and I'm sure it's pretty much accessible anywhere. But just to recap, Falcons open the season week 1 at home against Tampa Bay. Week 2 will be at the Minnesota Vikings on Sunday Night Football for the first primetime game of the year for Atlanta. They do have 5, which is a nice surprise. Week 3, the Falcons go on the road to the Panthers. Week 4 at home against the Commanders in a big potential revenge game for Michael Penix. Week 5 is the bye week, which unfortunate timing there, but maybe necessary because right after that, the Falcons face the Buffalo Bills on Monday Night Football. Then they face the San Francisco 49ers on the road on Sunday Night Football. And then week 8 is against the Miami Dolphins at home. Week 9 at the New England Patriots. Week 10, the Berlin game, where the Falcons take on the Indianapolis Colts. That's technically an away game, thankfully. Week 11, Falcons face the Panthers at home. Week 12 at the Saints. That's going to be a big game, the first Saints game of the year. Week 13 at the Jets. Week 14 against the Seattle Seahawks at home. Week 15 at the Bucs on Thursday Night Football. And then week 16 at the Cardinals. Week 17 against the Rams. I believe that's another primetime game. I can't remember if I think that's Monday night as well. So that's exciting. It's the second Monday night game and the final so far. There could always be, changes late in the season of Atlanta's primetime games. And then week 18, Saints at home to close the season. So, on paper, not necessarily the most dangerous schedule, but some tough teams on there, right? So right off the bat, the Falcons, 3 of their first 4 games are going to be against teams with winning records, with the Bucs obviously being a critical division matchup at the Vikings, a team that won 14 games last year, and then against the Commanders, thankfully at home, but another team that made the NFC Championship last year. So 3 out of those 4 games are going to be brutal matchups. And week 3, the one that should be easier, is at your division rival Panthers, where, the Panthers should be better this year. How much better, I don't know. But you do have to go on the road, and that's a division game. And typically you would expect to split those games, right? So, Atlanta's got to find a way to get some wins there. They do get a break in week 5 with that bye. And I typically hate early buys. I think most analytics people would tell you that that's wise, that you don't really want that. Given how tough that opening schedule is, where the Falcons play like 3 of their hardest games in that stretch in terms of strength of schedule, the week 5 bye might not be the worst thing in the world here for the team to kind of regroup and be able to give the Buffalo Bills the following week their best shot on Monday Night Football, because they'll need it, right, for that game. And then they have to go on the road to the 49ers, which, like, the 49ers can be really good. They can not be good. I mean, it's hard to say with this team. They've definitely bled some talent. It seems like the Shanahan magic might kind of be wearing off there, but this is a team that oscillates between good and bad pretty much, on the regular. So I'm not sure by week 7 what we'll be looking at in terms of San Francisco, but if that team's healthy, obviously very dangerous. Then the Falcons get a pretty easy stretch here. The Dolphins, I don't know that that's a cupcake game or anything like that, but that team, I think, entirely depends on Tua's health, and I just really worry about him being able to make it through a season at this point. Week 8, we'll see if Tua's playing, but if Tua's not playing, the Dolphins will probably be one of the worst teams in football. If Tua is playing, they could be really, really dangerous. At the Patriots, that is, the Patriots are not going to be the pushover they were last year, but again, that's a game you're hoping to win. The Colts, that team as well, shouldn't strike fear into anyone's heart, right? Week 11 at home against the Panthers, you're expecting to win that game. Week 12 at the Saints, I think the Saints are probably in the running for the worst team in football this year, so you should be expecting to sweep the Saints if that's the case. And then at the Jets in week 13, again, you're not really too concerned about that. And then you get to this last stretch here where the Seahawks, I think, can be a frisky team for sure, so not really sure what to expect there. Then you're at the Bucs on Thursday Night Football, which probably will be one of the most critical games of the season. At the Cardinals, who, that one is a little bit maybe of a break, but the Cardinals can be weird. This team has an interesting history with the Cardinals. Then you play the Rams in primetime at home. That could be a big NFC game as well if the Falcons are actually competing still at this point. And then you get the Saints at home in week 18 and what you're hoping is a game that you don't really have to even play your starters in. But if you do, again, New Orleans probably not going to be great this year. But that is a tough division game always, no matter how good these teams are. So you're going to have to bring, everything you've got to win that one if you need to. But in terms of like strength of opponent, that's one that you're probably banking on winning at the end of the day. So, I'm not going to do, a win prediction thing. We're going to reprise last year's series with Eric Robinson, where we went through all the games and we all sort of gave our season predictions. We're going to do that. I think it's going to be not next week, but the 2 weeks after that. So, kind of spread it more into the dead period, right? And we'll talk about sort of our thoughts on actually predicting these games in the Falcons season. But for now, I think you look at the opponents overall and, on paper, in terms of Vegas win total projections, right? The over-unders of these win totals. The Falcons actually do have the 4th easiest strength of schedule on paper in terms of projected win totals. This can change. It actually changed quite a bit last year, where the Falcons were projected to have one of the easiest schedules. It ended up not being that at all. So this obviously could change as well. The Falcons 4th at this point. And a lot of that has to do with the Saints and the Panthers obviously being projected as not very good teams. So, we'll have to see. So at this point, you're thinking maybe the Falcons have a pretty decent chance of getting some benefit here, right? The other side of the coin is looking at the rest advantage conferred by this schedule. And again, you can read the full write-up from Adnan on the site. But basically, the Falcons come out more or less even, right? So it's kind of the Falcons, I think, have 11 days of net rest advantage time, which is basically how many days of bonus rest they get relative to their opponent, and they end up having 12 days of rest disadvantage time, which is how many days they have like a net disadvantage of rest versus their opponent. So they have a net total of -1, which is pretty much like, average. I think it's like 18th or 19th in the rankings of like, rest advantage. So that's about, even. Obviously it's slightly under even, but, at the end of the day, it's mostly a fair estimate. Honestly, this used to be something that was more of a given. Like the NFL tried really hard to give rest parity. They don't do that anymore. And in fact, I know Warren Sharp has done a ton of work on tracking this over the years, and it's been getting worse. This year slightly better than last year is the short version, but ultimately, the NFL has seemed to stop caring to some extent about whether or not the schedule is like quote unquote fair in terms of rest. They just don't. They've really started skewing things, and it's getting ridiculous to where some teams now, have a ridiculous advantage and some are absolutely hosed. Like for instance, I know. I think Sharp has the Detroit Lions with a 13-day net rest advantage overall, like +13. The Falcons are -1, right around average. The Lions are +13. The Dolphins are +11, and the Rams are +10. And they've also got some teams getting absolutely hosed. Like I think the Las Vegas Raiders are -16 or something like that. And the New Orleans Saints are -14, which you won't see me shedding any tears about that either, but it's notable. I believe the Carolina Panthers are -5, so it's just really rough for some teams. And I don't know. I think it's more about the NFL has just kind of shifted their focus to making the biggest marquee matchups and all that stuff, as opposed to giving fairness in this way in the schedule. I know Sharp had said that there's a rare thing where you'll get a team that plays 3 games in 10 days, which the NFL had actually eliminated this for about 5 years from 2019 to 2023, and then they started bringing it back. And since 2005, teams that play that 3-10 stretch, they are 4-9 collectively in that third game. So by the time they get to that third of 3 games in 10 days, you're very unlikely to win that game, statistically speaking. So, that just, it's more of a grander critique of how the NFL has started to continuously just, kind of throw the fairness out the window in favor of just, getting as many ratings as they can. And you kind of don't blame them on some level for that. But I do think that it's going to, some teams are going to get hosed every year if they continue to do this. Luckily, the Falcons aren't one of those teams this year, but, it's tough but fair this year for the Falcons is kind of my takeaway. So you look at that, you look at the overall strength of schedule, and you look at the construction of the schedule that we sort of touched on, and this is a really tough opening where the Falcons are going to kind of have to endure a really difficult stretch where I think it's, I think they would be favored at this point to start the season 1-3. But I would say, if they start the season 1-3, it's very likely they could go 1-4 because they have to play the Bills on Monday Night Football after that. Then they got to travel to the 49ers. And, obviously if you're 1-4 or 1-5 after that 49ers game, you're pretty much cooked, right? You're not really, your season's pretty much over. You're going to have to, pull off a miracle. So they can't really afford to do that, obviously, but they're set up in such a way that they have a brutal stretch. So they're going to have to find a way to get some big wins and carve out some stuff. Last year, a similar situation where the Falcons had the Eagles and the Chiefs back-to-back in those opening weeks. They managed to kind of survive that by getting that clutch victory against the Eagles. So that's kind of what they're going to be hoping for. A similar setup week 2 against the Vikings. Maybe you can steal a win there or, and I think obviously the Falcons, if they really want to compete for this division, you have to be able to beat the Vikings in your house, right? You have to be able to beat them in Atlanta in week 1 and start out on the right foot. I think the Falcons could beat the Bucs week 1, they're probably okay, right? And then you're hoping to you can just hope that you're going to beat the Panthers in week 3 and feel good about that. Then you can probably afford to not have to have a miracle against the Vikings, which again, like, we don't know how good JJ McCarthy is, so maybe that game doesn't need to be a miracle. Maybe it does. We'll have to see. This is extremely early. This is why we're not doing like win-loss right now. We'll save that for June, which will also, of course, be way too early, but will be fun nonetheless. But again, we saw the Commanders aren't unbeatable. The Falcons probably should have beat them if they had a kicker that could hit, a 54-yard field goal, right? But they didn't, and they lost that due to some, really dumb stuff. So the Falcons are certainly capable, I think, of starting strong. And the other side of the coin is this is a difficult schedule that could see them really fall behind early. But if they were to outperform expectations and start strong, they would probably be the talk of the NFL, right? So the NFL's kind of set them up to give them this opportunity, right? That's why I call it tough but fair, because later on you do get a stretch in the middle of the season where you have the ability to make up some ground that you might have lost, right? So if they're, 2-3 going into, week 7, against the 49ers, if you can claw that out, or maybe they're 2-4, they just have that difficult stretch, right? You got the Dolphins, Patriots, Colts, Panthers. You could reasonably go on a 4-game winning streak there and get above 500, get to 6-4, going into, some critical division matchups and stuff like that to close out the season. So I think if the Falcons are 2-4 at, early, they could recover from that because of that sort of middle softening of the schedule. Now, that middle part of the schedule historically has been when the Falcons have fallen apart completely. It's what happened last year. It's what happened the year before. They've kind of had this soft middle and just bungled it. They've just bungled it from one way or another, miss 3-4 kicks in a game, lose to Will Levis in his first start, the list goes on and on. But I think the construction of the schedule, again, that's why I call it tough but fair, because I think it's tough opening, kind of a brutal start, where you have the opportunity to really turn heads and build a lot of national attention for yourself with these matchups. This isn't like a cupcake opening where the Falcons could be 4-0. No one's going to be talking about it. No, the Falcons are 4-0 going into that bye with wins against the Bucs, Vikings, and Commanders. Probably no one cares about the Panthers. Sorry, Panthers fans. Not saying nobody cares about your team like at all. I'm just saying like national media is probably not going to talk about a divisional matchup in the NFC South other than if the Bucs are involved. It's just kind of where we are. But, if you're 4-0 with wins against those 3 NFC playoff teams, people will be talking, and they won't be talked about as this is some fluke star where they're just beating up on some cupcake teams. This is like, wow, these Falcons are legit. So they have the opportunity to do that. And then if you do struggle, like I said, you do have the opportunity, I think, to recover in the middle of the season. You just have to actually do that. Like if the Falcons are playing tight games and just losing heartbreakers to these teams early, I think we should probably be feeling okay about their ability to beat up on some teams that they should be able to beat up on in that middle stretch, right? So we'll see. There's obviously a lot that goes into that, but that's kind of where I land. And it would be better than not to have a better rest advantage. But they're sort of just -1, which again, like I mentioned, like you could be way, way, way worse off than this. You could be -16 like the Raiders or -13 like the Saints, where the NFL's just kind of buried you with being basically on the receiving end of like 3 teams coming off buys and all this other stuff. That's going to really hurt you, right? And it's going to make it very difficult for you to outperform expectations because of that. The Falcons really aren't in that situation. They're not being helped, but they're not being hurt. So again, fair, but not really beneficial. And then you look at the overall, projected win totals, which again, couching appropriately, these are just projections, so they will change. So it could get better or worse depending on how teams perform. These teams, it should theoretically be possible for the Falcons to do well. Like, this is not a brutal schedule on the whole, but it is a really tough start to the year. So thankfully, I think on the defensive side, something that I will say is a plus to Ulbrich and Dan Quinn schemes in general is that they're pretty straightforward, and most NFL players at some point will have played in one of these schemes because they were so widespread, especially like veterans most of them have played in that type of scheme. It's all pretty similar. There will be wrinkles. There will be some terminology changes, but the whole point of those schemes to some extent is, you remember the Dan Quinn years, fast and physical. They're not throwing tons of coverage rules at you. It's probably going to be cover 3. It's going to be quarters. There's going to be some press man stuff from time to time, but it's not necessarily a scheme that it's not a Fangio defense where it's like, this is going to take some time for all these coverage rules and all this stuff to come together for these guys to figure this out. It's not like that. It's going to be a little bit simpler, should be a faster transition for this team. So the defense should be able to function right out of the gate. There are obviously a lot of new faces here. That's going to take time to gel, but I think, they don't have that schematic difficulty that I think a more complicated defense could early in the year. Offensively, the idea should be that this team is firing on all cylinders out of the gate. There's not the excuses of last year. This is not a first-year offensive coordinator anymore. This is not a new system coming in. This is not, a new quarterback, all that stuff. They've had all offseason to install. They've got a consistent quarterback the whole time. They've got most of the offense returning. This offense should be firing on all cylinders, ready to go out of the gate, and they kind of have to be, right? Especially given that we don't know how the defense is going to fare, even though it shouldn't be terrible. But so I think there is a scenario where, these factors line up. The Falcons get, some decent play out of their defense early, and they kind of, maybe take advantage of some teams that are finding their footing. That's kind of the thing about the early weeks, is that if you're a team returning a quarterback and a coaching staff and a scheme that's the same, you are likely to have an advantage in these first few weeks over a team like the Bucs, who's swapped their offensive coordinator for the 3rd time in 3 years. The Vikings, who are installing a new quarterback who missed the entire season to injury. The Panthers, obviously, and the Commanders are going to be relatively the same, so you don't necessarily get much of a boost there. But those first 2 games, Falcons might actually have sort of the experience advantage because of those factors that I just mentioned. So that could help them kind of overcome what might be a talent disparity or whatever you might say with those 2 teams. Ultimately, my takeaway is that this is a tough schedule, but it's also a fair schedule, and I think it's a schedule that offers a lot of opportunity for the Falcons to build really strong momentum if they are able to succeed early, really get the attention of the NFL, and the NFL, I think, believes that they will do that to some extent, or at least that they trust the Falcons ultimately to be entertaining to watch, like at a bare minimum, which I think is probably going to be the case. But I think it's up to the Falcons to kind of rise to the challenge, avoid rise up there, but, rise to the challenge, play these teams tough, get a couple wins out of it, maybe get some more wins out of it, and shock the NFL and build a lot of momentum going into, again, if you do perform well in that early stretch, you could really build a huge lead in the middle of the season if you're just firing on all cylinders and getting this going, because, again, that soft middle, it could either bail you out of a tough start or it could allow you to build a ton of momentum, and the Falcons could be the talk of the NFC as a surprise. They could be this year's Commanders, right? I think the schedule isn't necessarily doing Atlanta any favors. The strength of schedule projection is beneficial. The rest projection isn't really beneficial. The week 5 bye, I don't love a week 5 bye ever, but I think in this case might be helpful, might help them scrape out a win that they otherwise may not have been able to get by getting some extra prep for what's going to be a really tough Buffalo Bills team. So that's my takeaway, just quick takeaways on this schedule. I think that it's tough but fair. I think that the Falcons could struggle. They also could, defy expectations and really impress the NFL and become a big topic of the 2025 season if they outperform those expectations early, or they could get buried and they could, have dashed our hopes effectively by mid-October. But, we're prepared for that. So thanks so much for joining us today, guys. I'm Kevin Knight of Falcaholic. Kevin, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. Both of those help the channel a lot. Really appreciate it. If you want to support the show, you can also leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever else is out there still. You could also support the show on Patreon. It's patreon.com/FalcaholicLive. as well as joining the YouTube channel memberships if you're more of a video enjoyer. We'll be back next week with Aaron Freeman on Wednesday to continue talking about how this team has changed and evolved over this offseason, the draft, the UDFA class, the free agents. We'll get to all of that on Wednesday. And like I said, we'll be doing our season predictions with Eric Robinson over the next few weeks as well. So look forward to that. And then we'll be diving more into the roster analysis stuff as we get through these mini camps and see a little bit more of how the Falcons are kind of filling out and playing these guys. And we'll continue to bring you guys that offseason content as we eventually lose the trickle of news for about a month, but it'll be okay. We'll survive it. Thanks, guys, so much for joining us here on the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.